It started with a dream and ended with a nightmare. When I bought this house, I thought I was secure in my future, a cozy place to call my own, a space to build memories and make something truly mine. But I never expected that a stranger, a woman I had never wronged, would claim my home as hers. I never thought simple renovations would turn into a battlefield, and I certainly never imagined that one day I'd be staring down the barrel of a gun in my own front yard, my life hanging in the balance over a house that I legally owned. All because of one woman, a woman who was willing to do anything to take it from me. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. I never cared much for modern homes with their sterile, cookie-cutter designs. I wanted something with history, something with soul. That's why, when I found the house, a charming old place in a quiet neighborhood, I knew it was meant to be mine. It had been well maintained, but it needed work. I had big plans for it, nothing drastic, just some renovations to restore its original beauty. The first few days after moving in were peaceful. The neighbors were friendly, welcoming me with warm smiles and small talk. One couple, an older pair named Tom and Linda, told me stories about the previous owner, an elderly woman named Barbara who had lived in the house for decades. They spoke of her fondly, and it made me even more determined to take care of the home she had cherished. But not everyone was welcoming. There was one neighbor who stood out immediately, a woman named Karen. The first time I met her, something about her felt off. Her greeting was stiff, her smile forced. She didn't seem pleased to see a new face in the neighborhood, and at the time, I brushed it off as her just being the unfriendly type. But looking back, I realized it was a first warning sign. The first real encounter with Karen happened a week after I moved in. I had contractors coming in and out of the house, taking measurements, discussing plans, and preparing for renovations. I was in my driveway sorting through boxes when I noticed Karen standing on her porch, watching me. At first, it was just a glance, but then I realized she wasn't just looking. She was glaring. I tried to ignore it, but a few minutes later, she marched over. "So what's all this?" she asked, her tone sharp. I turned to her, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Just getting some renovations started. Nothing major, just some upkeep." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "You sure that's necessary?" Barbara never needed to change a thing in that house. It was perfect the way it was. I forced a polite smile. "I'm just making it my own, keeping the character, just fixing things up a bit." Karen scoffed, her eyes scanning the contractors moving around the yard. "You're not planning anything drastic, are you? This house is a neighborhood treasure." I wasn't sure why she was so invested in my house, but I shrugged it off. "Don't worry, just basic renovations." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded stiffly and walked away. That was the first time I noticed something strange about her, but I had no idea just how deep her obsession ran. The next few days, I kept catching her watching me. She would stand on her porch, arms crossed, staring as workers came and went. At first, I chalked it up to nosy neighbor behavior, but then she started interfering. One morning, I found her talking to my landscaper, questioning him about every little detail of his work. "Are you sure you're allowed to do this? Did you check with the city?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. I stepped in, forcing a smile. "Everything's been approved, Karen. No need to worry." She pursed her lips. "Well, I just hope you're not ruining the house." Then she walked away, but the tension remained. Over the next few days, she escalated. She started stopping my workers, demanding to see permits, inspecting their work as if she had any authority. She began making comments to passing neighbors, loudly expressing concern that I was destroying a piece of neighborhood history. Then came the moment that made my stomach drop. One evening, as I was locking up for the night, I found a note slipped under my door. The handwriting was jagged, rushed. My hands tightened as I read the words. "This house doesn't belong to you. It is mine. Leave before you regret it." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just an annoying neighbor being difficult. This was something else entirely. I had no idea what Karen's problem was, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to stop. The first few days after Karen made it clear she didn't approve of my renovations, I tried to ignore her. I wasn't the kind of person to get involved in petty neighborhood disputes, and I certainly didn't want to start one over something as simple as home improvements. But ignoring Karen turned out to be impossible. She didn't just disapprove. She was obsessed. Every morning, I would step outside to find her already there, standing on her porch, arms crossed, staring at my house as if she could stop the renovations by sheer force of will. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was harmless. That changed quickly. The first real sign that things were escalating came when my landscapers arrived to start working on the front yard. I had hired a reputable company to clean up the overgrown bushes, lay fresh sod, and install a new walkway to the front door. Simple, standard work. But as soon as they pulled into the driveway, Karen was there. She didn't approach me this time. She went straight to the workers, demanding to know what they were doing and whether they had permission. When I walked over to intervene, I heard her grilling one of the landscapers. "Who told you to do this?" she snapped, her voice sharp. "The homeowner," the man answered. Glancing in my direction, Karen turned, her expression furious. "This is a historic neighborhood. You can't just tear up a yard like this. Did you even get approval?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Karen, I already told you, I have all the necessary permits. This is my property." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Barbara would have never allowed this. You're ruining her house." I clenched my jaw. "Barbara doesn't live here anymore. I do." Her lips thinned into a hard line. For a moment, I thought she was going to argue, but instead, she turned on her heel and stormed back into her house. I hoped that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Within an hour, she was back, this time standing at the edge of her property with her phone in her hand, snapping pictures of the workers. I tried to ignore her, but the landscapers were getting uncomfortable. One of them approached me, looking uneasy. Sir, that woman keeps taking pictures of us. Is there something going on here?" I sighed. "It's just my neighbor. She's upset about the renovations." "Don't worry about it." He nodded, but the tension in the air was thick. I wanted to believe Karen would get bored and move on, but instead, she got worse. The next morning, when the contractors arrived to start on the exterior repainting, they found something disturbing. Several cans of paint had been knocked over, their contents spilled across the driveway. At first, I thought it was an accident, but the workers told me otherwise. "These were standing up when we left yesterday," one of them said, frowning at the mess. "Somebody knocked them over on purpose." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I had locked the gates, secured the work area, and yet somehow, in the middle of the night, the paint had been sabotaged. And I had a sick feeling I knew exactly who was responsible. I knocked on Karen's door, but she didn't answer. When I stepped back, I noticed the curtain in her front window twitch slightly. She was watching me, but she wasn't coming out. I installed security cameras that day. I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but at this point, I needed proof. I wasn't about to let my renovation be derailed by a bitter woman who thought she had some kind of claim to my home. I kept the cameras discreet, placing them under the eaves and along the fence line, but I made sure they covered the entire property. If Karen tried anything again, I would catch her. For a few days, things were quiet. Karen still watched me, still muttered under her breath whenever she saw me outside, but she didn't interfere. I thought maybe the cameras had scared her off. I was wrong. A week later, I woke up to find my mailbox smashed in. The wooden post had been completely splintered, as if someone had taken a bat to it. My stomach twisted as I stared at the wreckage, knowing this wasn't random vandalism. This was a message. I rushed to check the security footage, my hands shaking as I pulled up the app on my phone. When the video loaded, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the grainy glow of the night vision camera, was Karen. at around 3 in the morning. She had walked up to my mailbox, looked around, and then swung something heavy against it over and over until it broke apart. Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned and calmly walked back to her house. I stared at the footage, disbelief washing over me. She had actually done it. She had gone from passive-aggressive complaints to outright destruction, and she hadn't even tried to hide it. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. Would they even do anything? It was just a mailbox. I doubted they would take it seriously. Instead, I decided to confront her. I walked over to her house, my fists clenched at my sides. I knocked, harder this time. For a few seconds, there was no answer. Then the door opened just a crack, and Karen peered out at me with an expression of feigned innocence. Yes, I held up my phone, playing the footage right in front of her face. Do you want to explain this? Karen's expression didn't change. She didn't look guilty. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she smirked. It was an eyesore. Consider it a favor. My jaw tightened. You're trespassing on my property. You're vandalizing my stuff. This needs to stop. Karen folded her arms. Or what? I took a step back, shaking my head. I don't know what your problem is, but this is my house. I don't care what you think Barbara would have wanted. She didn't give you this place. Her family sold it to me. You have no say in what I do here. Karen's smirk faltered, just for a second. Then her lips curled into something more menacing. You don't belong here, she said quietly. You'll see. I wanted to argue, to yell, to tell her she was out of her mind, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. Instead, I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought that was the worst of it, but I had no idea how much further she was willing to go. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustling sound outside made my nerves spike. I checked the security footage constantly, half expecting to see Karen sneaking onto my property again. But the cameras stayed quiet. The next morning, I found out why. When I stepped outside, my breath caught in my throat. My car, my brand new car, had all 4 tires slashed. A long, jagged gash ran along the driver's side, deep enough to scrape the paint down to the metal. I swallowed hard, my hands clenching into fists. This wasn't just a warning. This was an attack. I pulled out my phone, already dialing the police. This time, I wasn't letting it slide. The police arrived within 30 minutes, but by then, I already knew how this was going to go. The officer took my statement, glanced at the slashed tires, and nodded along as I explained that I had security footage of my neighbor, Karen, vandalizing my property multiple times. But when I showed them the video, the response was exactly what I had dreaded. The footage wasn't clear enough. Sure, it was obviously Karen's shape, her build, her movements, but without a crystal-clear shot of her face, they claimed they couldn't make an arrest. My stomach tightened as the officer gave me the usual spiel about how I could file a report, and they'd keep an eye on things, but there wasn't much else they could do. My blood boiled. Karen had been terrorizing me for weeks, escalating from passive-aggressive behavior to actual property damage, and they were telling me their hands were tied. I wanted to scream, but I bit my tongue. As soon as the police left, I turned to see Karen standing on her porch, arms crossed, smirking. She knew nothing would happen to her, and she was enjoying every second of it. That was the moment I realized she wasn't just being difficult. She was playing a game, and she thought she was winning. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I got to work. I replaced my tires, repainted the gash on my car, and called a company to install high-resolution security cameras. If she wanted to keep pushing, I was going to be ready. For a few days, things were quiet. Karen still watched me from her porch, still muttered under her breath whenever she saw me outside, but she didn't interfere. I started to hope that maybe she had realized I wasn't going to be scared off, that maybe she was getting bored, but I should have known better. The silence was just a calm before the storm. One night, I was in my living room, going over some paperwork, when I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustling, but after everything that had happened, my senses were on high alert. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the live feed from the security cameras. My stomach dropped. There, just beyond the fence line, was Karen. She was crouched down, holding something in her hands. I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, suddenly, she stood up and I saw it. A canister. She was spraying something on my windows. I jumped to my feet and rushed outside, my heart pounding. The moment she saw me, she dropped the can and took off running back to her house. I sprinted after her, but she was already inside before I could reach her property. My hands clenched into fists as I turned back to my house, stepping closer to inspect the damage. My blood ran cold. She had spray painted across my windows in thick, dripping red letters. "Get out." I snapped pictures, my hands shaking with fury. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a threat. I stormed back inside, my mind racing. This was beyond just a petty dispute now. Karen wasn't just trying to annoy me. She was trying to scare me. And for the first time, I felt a sliver of fear creep into my chest. Because what if it wasn't just words next time? I called the police again, and once again they came, took my statement, and left without doing anything. Without an eyewitness or clear video evidence, there's not much we can do, the officer told me. I wanted to grab him by the collar and shake him, demand to know how much more evidence they needed. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Karen knew exactly how far she could push without crossing the line into something that would actually get her arrested. And that made her dangerous. I wasn't going to sit back and let her terrorize me. If the police wouldn't do anything, I would. I replaced the spray-painted windows, but I left the cameras rolling, repositioning them to cover every possible angle. I stayed up late, watching the feeds, waiting for her to slip up. And then, 2 nights later, she did. At exactly 2:37 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. My stomach twisted as I pulled up the footage. Karen was back. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 men stood beside her, both wearing hooded sweatshirts. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched them move toward my house. One of the men pulled something out of his pocket, a crowbar. My body moved before my brain caught up. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and ran to my front door, flicking on the floodlights. The second the yard lit up, the 3 of them froze like deer caught in headlights. Then, just as quickly, they turned and bolted. I didn't chase them. I didn't need to. The cameras had caught everything. This time, when the police arrived, I had more than just suspicion. I had proof. Clear footage of Karen and 2 unidentified men attempting to break into my home. The officers reviewed the footage on site, their expressions shifting from indifference to something much more serious. Within the hour, Karen was in handcuffs, screaming about how she was a real victim, how I had stolen her home, how she was only trying to reclaim what was rightfully hers. But no one was listening. As they loaded her into the back of the squad car, she turned to look at me, her face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," she spat. "You'll see." I stared at her, my jaw tight. "Yeah," I said quietly. "We'll see." I thought Karen's arrest would be the end of it. I thought finally I could move on, finish my renovations in peace, and enjoy the home I had worked so hard for. But I underestimated just how deep her delusion ran. She wasn't just obsessed with my house. She genuinely believed it belonged to her. And even from behind bars, she found a way to make her presence known. The day after her arrest, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I stepped outside to grab my morning coffee from the cafe down the street, but the moment I reached my car, my stomach twisted. There, carved deep into my driver's side door, were the words, "Still mine." My hands tightened into fists as I scanned the street, my skin crawling with unease. She was locked up. She had been taken away in handcuffs. So who had done this? I called the police, and when they arrived, they confirmed what I already suspected. Karen had an accomplice, someone in the neighborhood, someone who still believed whatever nonsense she had fed them, had carried out this act on her behalf. But once again, without cameras catching the act, there was nothing they could do. They took my statement, told me they would patrol the area more frequently, and then left. I stood there staring at the damage, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. This wasn't over. Karen might have been locked away, but she wasn't done playing her twisted game. Determined not to let her or her accomplice scare me off, I replaced the damaged door, installed even more security cameras, and kept moving forward with the renovations. The weeks passed, and while the occasional strange occurrence happened, faint tapping on my windows at night, footsteps crunching on my driveway with no one in sight, it wasn't enough to shake me. I refused to let paranoia take over my life. Then one evening, I received a letter. It wasn't mailed. It was hand-delivered, slipped under my front door while I was in the shower. My blood ran cold the second I saw my name scrawled across the envelope in jagged handwriting. I unfolded the paper with shaky hands. You think you won? You think bars will stop me? This house was always meant to be mine. One way or another, I will get it back. I exhaled sharply, my grip tightening around the note. This was insanity. This wasn't just some bitter neighbor feud anymore. This was dangerous. I considered packing up and leaving, selling the house, and washing my hands of this entire nightmare. But the idea of giving Karen what she wanted, of letting her win, made me sick to my stomach. No, I had fought too hard for this house. I wasn't going anywhere. I handed the letter over to the police, and to my relief, they took it seriously this time. With Karen already facing charges for attempted burglary and harassment, this new evidence only added to her growing list of crimes. But even knowing she was behind bars, the unease never left me. I slept with a baseball bat next to my bed, flinched at every unexpected sound, and constantly checked my security cameras. I wasn't afraid of ghosts, but Karen was a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Then, just when I thought things couldn't escalate any further, I woke up in the middle of the night to the blaring sound of my alarm. My heart pounded as I shot out of bed, grabbing my phone to check the cameras. The moment the feed loaded, my stomach dropped. A figure was standing in my backyard, staring up at my bedroom window. The motion-activated floodlights had caught them in full view, but they didn't run. They just stood there, unmoving, watching. I scrambled for my phone and called the police, barely able to keep my voice steady, as I told them someone was on my property. I didn't care who it was, whether it was Karen's accomplice, some random intruder, or a figment of my worst nightmare. I just needed them gone. Within minutes, sirens filled the night air, flashing lights casting eerie shadows across my yard. The figure bolted just as the police arrived, but this time, they weren't fast enough. Officers chased them down, tackling them to the ground near the end of the street. When they pulled off the hood, I felt the breath leave my lungs. It wasn't Karen, but it was someone I recognized. It was her son. I hadn't seen him before. He had never come by, never been around to witness his mother's downward spiral. But now it all made sense. He had been the one carving threats into my car, slipping letters under my door, lurking outside my house in the dead of night. He wasn't just helping Karen. He was carrying on her twisted mission in her absence. And the way he looked at me, even as the officers hauled him toward the patrol car, sent a chill through my bones. "This isn't over," he spat, his eyes burning with fury. "You'll never be safe in that house." I wanted to respond, to tell him he was insane, that this house would never belong to him or his mother, but I didn't. I was too tired, too drained to argue with someone who was clearly just as lost in delusion as she was. Instead, I watched as they shoved him into the back of the squad car and drove away. The days that followed felt different, lighter. The tension that had weighed on my shoulders since the day I moved in had finally started to lift. With both Karen and her son locked away, I could finally breathe. The renovations were finished. The house was exactly as I had dreamed it would be, and for the first time in months, it truly felt like mine. But even as I stood in the front yard, admiring the home I had fought so hard to protect, a voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. This isn't over. Not really. Because people like Karen, people who convince themselves they're entitled to something, who believe the world owes them, don't just disappear. And even though she was locked away, I had a feeling that one day, somehow, she would find a way to crawl back into my life. But when that day came, I would be ready.